Thank you for your presence, maybe a minute or two early, but I think I'll get underway. I always have difficulty pacing myself and finishing in the time limit and so forth. I'll say in the beginning, I'm not the expert on the Civil War, but I am writing on Restoration history, and I have been a couple of times in the last couple of years going over this period for sure. And frankly, I've found that as I do that, I have kind of searched my own soul, asked myself about my own faith, but I have had the faith to hold my heart and head steady while everything around me was going in every other direction. So I actually found it a useful exercise to go deeper than I had before, and hopefully it'll have some benefits for you as well. Okay, I left the topic general, so I could change my mind a lot of times about what I would do in particular. There's a great deal more, and in a real sense, we ought to start with slavery and that controversy, because that certainly affected the Restoration movement. Alexander Campbell took a terrific beating over his stance on slavery. There were abolitionists in the North. Two of his sisters were abolitionists. And they put pressures on the missionary society, on preachers and others. So there's a lot that we could begin with, but I'm afraid I won't even finish with what I have. So we're going to assume that and go forward from here. Abraham Lincoln was elected November 6, 1860. And of course the extremists began immediately to plan for secession. At the end of the month, Talbot Fanning, the gospel advocate's about 5 years old now, he founded it, began a 6-month tour of Dixie. Said he wanted to spend a month with the brethren of the South. And he reported on that in the February issue of the Gospel Advocate, tour through Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. Can you hear me all right? I think actually his first stop was in Corinth. I haven't noted that in the notes. As I remember, though, he made a comment about an almost finished church building in Corinth that he had seen 2 years before, and it was the same when he arrived in 1860. So he did what we couldn't do today. He called out the leaders in the church by name in the Advocate. But it was Jackson that he was particularly interested in. He had never witnessed political excitement like this before. He dined with Brother Caskey, that's T.W. Caskey. Some of you in the room are going to know more about him than I do. He's certainly a pioneer preacher in Mississippi. I think in things I have encountered that he actually preached in Alabama as well, particularly West Alabama, may have gotten to this area. Well, he was there around the State House and was much involved in drafting the document for secession in Mississippi. And Fanning observed that, Brother Caskey was a giant in strength, but unfortunately is cumbered by much serving in mystic temples in the political arena. I need to be careful about overstating the case, but I think it is important to remember that words from Talbot Fanning are not idle words. And this is putting it awfully simply, but he had the idea that the kingdom is the kingdom of God. governments of the world are kingdoms that Satan controls. And he didn't think the Christian really ought to be involved, spending time, money, energy, emotion, and so forth on other kingdoms. In fact, I don't think it's far from the truth to say that since I vote, though I'm not politically active in other ways, I still would be a politician in his eyes, just that I involve myself to that degree. And so when he talks about what the brethren are excited about, that we have to remember is laid aside what he thinks they should be doing. All of us should be doing. He preached to a small audience in Jackson. I think it was 14 years prior that he had been there, and actually was one of the first people to gather Christians in that part of Mississippi. So he was very disappointed at the audience that he had, but everyone's excited about something else. New Orleans, he said he strolled the streets of the city for 2 or 3 days in search of brethren, finally found 2 or 3, but they weren't meeting for worship. Well, I think there would be evidence that in New Orleans at that time, they never actually stopped worshiping together, but he didn't find many, and he was severely disappointed. On his way back, he doesn't mention every location. He did mention Selma, Alabama. He was somewhat pleased with what he found in Selma, but not Marion.
Lights are down.
I'm sorry.
The lights down.
Okay. That may be the projector. Maybe when Will steps in, we can.
Okay, we can see it.
Not anymore.
Now it's gone.
Okay.
Is it coming from here?
Says computer up there. Says no signal.
I moved it forward, but she didn't want me to. I'll go see if I can find Will.
Okay, hopefully we get some help. I'll continue in the meantime. In Marion, I'm not from Alabama, but my experience with Marion in 35 or 40 years that the church struggles. It's kind of a mission point and so forth. But note his comments, where once was the most promising church in all the cotton states. Speculators in sacred things had done the mischief.
It's coming from this projector, I think. Will, is it coming from this laptop?
No, I think that's separate.
When you change your slide on here, I'm gonna just put that on the screen.
Okay.
Save time.
So I just got a promotion.
Yes.
Yeah, he got promotion.
And if you don't mind, I'll let you change. Again, I had trouble with that remote yesterday. I was backing up when I intended to go forward. He stopped in Montgomery, found the city and state convulsed with revolutionary movements, saw no brethren, left in a few hours. I may have left something out from his actual wording. I think that means he didn't even spend the night in Montgomery. He was here a few hours, and he got the sense what was going on. I know ASF here in Montgomery had a play, can't remember what it was, on the Civil War excitement right before the beginning of the war here in Montgomery. And I know that drama played it up.
But there were brethren here.
Yes, he seems to have expected to see more than he got to see. Went on to Atlanta, was more impressed, found some excellent brethren there, but one brother, fine address, superior talents and learning, wore a feather in his hat and held a glittering sword in his right hand. I'm not an authority on the Civil War. Many of you will know more about it, but a Confederate general named McCulloch was killed at Pea Ridge, and I'm told he had a bizarre dress, but he always had a big feather in his hat. Well, Fanning doubted that he also had the glittering sword, and Fanning doubted that he'd be able to hold the sword of Georgia in his right hand and the sword of the Spirit in the other. With no unkindness to that man, he says, or to many other preachers in the South, he would like to have been able to say to all of them, in love, just pause and reflect before you go too far. He arrived home on Christmas Day with a solemn conviction that it's impossible for the people to be greatly excited on two subjects at the same time. And again, I think he really means that. Everybody ought to be excited about the kingdom of God all the time. And even in normal times, you shouldn't be concerned with the kingdoms of the world. I think in general, we would have to say that most people at least counseled neutrality, and many were out and out pacifists. And there's a great deal that Fanning said that I haven't gathered together, but one statement I think certainly does answer for all of that. Christian ought to employ no weapon except the sword of the Spirit, the Jerusalem blade. Campbell also says a great deal. There's a famous address that he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia. I think it's 1848. It's not long after the Mexican War, that I'm told that pacifists still refer back to. It's kind of a classic in that way. So particularly if you combed over the Millennial Harbinger, I think you'd find a great deal there. In June, though, of 61, you can see that he's beside himself. Civilized America, civilized United States, boasting of a humane and Christian paternity and fraternity, unsheathing your swords, discharging your cannon, boasting of your heathen brutality, gluttonously satiating your furious appetites for fraternal blood. Christian brother against Christian brother. Nothing like it on the pages of time. Okay. W.K. Pendleton is his son-in-law. He writes a good bit at the time, basically counsel, let not brother meet brother in battle. J.W. McGarvey, prominent, I would rather 10,000 times be killed for refusing to fight than to fall in battle or to come home victorious with the blood of my brethren on my hands. We'll see McGarvey again later. Benjamin Franklin, the editor of the American Christian Review. I don't want to insult your knowledge, but I don't know that everyone is acquainted with the American Christian Review. I often look at it as the gospel advocate of the North. I had an experience, this is a long, long time ago. Must have been a graduate student somewhere, but I was taking care of some assignment, and it meant reading from the review and also reading from the Advocate. And I was in the old library at Lipscomb in the basement where they had the microfilm machines. And I read all afternoon. I was tired toward the end of the day, and I was reading, and I realized I don't know which one I'm in, the Advocate or the Review. So I had to scroll back up to determine which one. Literally, I did find them that much alike. Franklin says property may be destroyed and safety endangered or life lost, but we are under Christ. We will not kill or encourage anybody to kill or fight the brethren. T.M. Allen, a giant in the early generations in Missouri. I would sooner go to the grave being killed for not killing my brother than go to the tomb with my brother's blood on his hands. Okay? There is, or was, what was called the Missouri Circular. 14 preachers signed it. They indicated many more would have had we been able to get to all of them. I suspect J.W. McGarvey was prominent in that because he is the one I know that furnished it to one or two of the journals and appended a note, explanation to it. It's about a page long, as I remember, but basically we cannot, by the New Testament, which is our rule of discipline, justify ourselves in engaging in the fraternal strife now raging. In the South, people like Lipscomb and Talbot Fanning as well, E.G. Sewell, Trimble, but there were others. These four names I recall were greatly concerned that young men were going to rush off to the Confederate Army, and indeed they had. Most of them had already left. This is almost a year later. Many had left Franklin College already, but they were concerned that the government would not honor the conscientious objector status of many of the young men, and they certainly wanted to do all they could to provide for that. So a petition to the Confederate government, they planned to take it all the way to Richmond if necessary. I think they found an official as close as McMinnville or someplace like that in Tennessee where they could have it delivered to the Confederate president. But they were successful in that. No man who regards the authority of God can in any manner engage in, aid, foment, or countenance the strifes and animosities and so on. Okay, this is a part of their explanation as they appealed to the Confederate government. It had to be done twice in Tennessee, however, because the Union Army, I think maybe late in 1862, took control of Nashville, basically Middle Tennessee, and at one point decided they were going to conscript soldiers for the Union Army from Tennessee. And so Lipscomb, Sewell, and Trimble went to the military governor, Andrew Johnson, in Nashville with a little difficulty, but again, they were successful in saving some men from having to go. Okay, I'm not picking on Isaac Errett, although Isaac Errett's not one of my favorite people in Restoration history. There were many who thought like he did, but I can't think of anyone any more prominent all the way around than Isaac Errett. In 1866, he would be the founding editor of the Christian Standard, and he'd be the editor until he died in 1888. Be a much more moderate voice, maybe sometimes liberal voice than the American Christian Review, certainly at odds with the Gospel Advocate, and so forth. He was already, though still fairly young at this time, already well known as a preacher, and he had been a co-editor, was at this time a co-editor of the Millennial Harbinger. When firing took place at Sumter, I think he was with Alexander Campbell, I believe in Richmond, Southern Virginia at least. They were raising money for Bethany College. Campbell had gotten him also as a fundraiser. So they immediately took the trains back, Boston to Baltimore, I believe, and finally to Pittsburgh and home. And they witnessed a lot of what Fanning witnessed on their way home. I'm using the words of his biographer here. He had denounced Union sentiments and had decided if this has to be settled by force, then he would give his influence to the side he believed right. I think there's some details that his biographer leaves out, and that irritated David Lipscomb later on to no end. He didn't think the truth was told about Errett, but maybe some things at best not told, I'm not sure. He made rousing speeches, visited and stirred up soldiers in the camps, and sometimes even tried to help provide for families of soldiers. McGarvey understood this. He thought it was important, if he could, to enlist someone like Errett on the side of peace. And so he says it's absolutely necessary at a time like this for our leading men, preachers, professors, editors, should take no active partisan position. The more prudent brethren ought to speak out plainly for the benefit of the more rash. Well, Errett responded, but it's not been saved, or at least no one seems to have found it. We know the answer was no, though, because we have what McGarvey said in reply. Your favor is received and carefully perused, and although we differ as widely as ever, I'm glad to be assured that you have no disposition to push your views forward in such a way as to injure the cause. I have no doubt that you could easily produce a serious division in the churches in the North, and obviously that was true. Are we together?
Here's one slide behind.
One of the interesting things for me to look at is what happens in the colleges. Of course, it's the young men, for the most part, who will do the fighting, and the effects are pretty dramatic there. What at the time was the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, now be known as Hiram student earlier. He's president at this time. When the news came, 20 students left immediately. Usually, the historians seem to say when all was told, 250 students from Hiram were serving in the Army, and that, I think in every case, was the Union Army. And part of that was because Garfield himself recruited. Some of the historians say he recruited from the church steps. Maybe that's so, but I remember reading a letter to his wife while he was on the second round of recruiting, and he was going basically through the old Mahoning district of northeast Ohio, and a lot of those churches the second time around wouldn't let him have the building, but his language indicates to me that they let him inside to use the building. In fact, one of the historians, I've forgotten who makes the point that it was odd to picture, say, 40 or 50 young men going forward as they were answering the invitation, and something like that had happened just a few years ago under his preaching. Now he is recruiting them for the Union Army. Well, whether on the steps or inside the buildings, he complained to his wife that he had to go looking for another church rather than a disciples' church in a particular place. Okay. Northwestern Christian University, if we had started with abolitionism in the movement, then we would know that there was a rival university to Bethany and Bacon and others, and that was Northwestern Christian, now Butler University. There was a Northwestern Christian magazine, so a rival periodical, and also a rival missionary society. So part of all that goes on is the pressure that the abolitionists put on the people who are otherwise moderate supporters of the Union. One thing I think most people wouldn't recognize is Bethany was really almost a Southern college. The war came at 20 years in its history, and Bethany had a total of 1,761 students by that time. I didn't break it out Southern. I have a little difficulty deciding what is a border state, but I put Southern and border together. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a total number. 1,761 is from Southern states. 322 from those clearly Union states. I'll talk a little bit about this later. I didn't realize I entered something here. Bethany is, of course, in the panhandle of West Virginia, squeezed in between the Pennsylvania line and the Ohio River. If you accidentally end up in Bethany, then you've really been lost, because you only get to Bethany with difficulty. You have to know where you are going. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the western counties west of the Alleghanies will not be in favor of secession. So out of that comes by 1863 a new state accepted into the Union as West Virginia. What I was trying to explain, the Home Guard situation. Even though basically West Virginia is Unionist, the Panhandle area, and particularly Bethany, ends up with a good bit of Confederate Southern sentiment. You had home guards built up in various areas of what would be West Virginia, but Bethany a little more secessionist in its leaning, actually created a home guard against the other home guards. And so when they're concerned about students having pen knives, they're concerned about trouble with the other home guards, or when they're concerned about Confederate flags, I assume, in student rooms and so forth. And that's what the dynamic that's going on. Okay. Franklin College in Nashville, probably you know that if you fly in or out of Nashville, you're basically at what was Elm Crag, is taught at Fanning's farm, and also the site of Franklin College. It's written that when Lincoln called for troops, students left in squads and companies. I may have to depend on you, Mike. Ultimately, with Union occupation, Union troops used the buildings at Franklin, actually abused Talbot Fanning. He doesn't go into great detail, but he does mention that generally he is treated like a traitor, and then after the war, suspected by people of the South as well. Okay, I'm basically going home when I get to Arkansas College. I'm not an expert on this, but Fayetteville is my county seat, 19 miles away. Until I studied Restoration history, I didn't know about Arkansas College, but I understand now why College Avenue, that I knew growing up, is there and not out where the university is now, because it was Arkansas College. Robert Graham and William Baxter, both Bethany graduates, and both English, born in England. Graham founded it, and then Baxter came later and replaced him. And Graham gone a year and then came back, and they were working together when the war broke out. There's a presentation later this evening about missions among the Indians. Among the students they attracted to Arkansas College, in particular Creek Indians, but I think other Indians. It's only 20, 30 miles to Indian territory from there. Well, I don't know how many went south and how many went north, but the college closed. They simply did not have students. The college fronted on, I mentioned College Avenue, that was Telegraph Road. It was the Butterfield Overland Mail route. So two battles in that part of the country are explained by that. Telegraph Road coming out of Springfield, Missouri, winding its way southwest to Fayetteville and further southwest down to Fort Smith, then across Indian Territory some way to Texas, and finally to California. Wells Fargo had some money in this, and after the war, they made their own route, the Pony Express and so forth, a much shorter direct route. But what I'm thinking about that here is that this is a highway, and everybody goes back and forth, north, south, guerrillas in between, and so forth. So if, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, one further and then we'll back up. This is a relatively new edition. This is William Baxter. He wrote a biography of Walter Scott. He wrote a biography of Knowles Shaw. He wrote hymns. He wrote poetry. I don't use the word elegant very often, but this is an elegant telling of a very dark story. If you want to know what war is like, particularly Civil War, this is one of the best books. It's not a big book, but you see the war from most every angle. He certainly is a Unionist, but he tells it both ways. You probably could get it library loan. I don't think we have it here in our library, but University of Arkansas, I think, keeps it in print. Okay, if we go back one. Okay, this is the story of the encounter with B.F. Hall. B.F. Hall was one of the first to declare baptism for the remission of sins. He is the one who was doing the preaching up in the Florence area when Talbot Fanning was baptized as a teenager. He didn't do the baptizing, as I understand it, but it was the preacher. Okay, he'd gone to Texas from Alabama, and he will be the chaplain, though he was armed and making all sorts of threats. Basically, if you see a Yankee, let me know. I'm a good shot. It's actually Robert Graham says to Baxter after they've had that session with him in Fayetteville, I feel like we were with a highwayman. It's a striking thing to read and hear, but gives us an idea of what happened to some people when they completely lost their senses. He went back to Texas, by the way, after the war and preached effectively. I read in one place that he held a long meeting in Waco, and that's the beginning of the church in Waco. Okay? And beyond. Okay, just a list, and I'll try to move quickly here, of people who did enter as combatants. Alexander Campbell Jr., he lived on a plantation. Sometimes I read Mississippi, sometimes Louisiana. I'm wondering if that family actually had two. I think it was in Louisiana. I think it was a short distance west of Natchez. David Richardson, that's a very sad story. Robert Richardson, the biographer of Alexander Campbell, pleaded with his son, don't go, you don't know what you're doing. But he joined anyway. He was killed then a year or so later in battle, and the story is that Robert Richardson could never mention his son in the family circle again. I don't think he ever got over that. This is a story I won't have time to tell. W.H. Hobson, one of the effective evangelists of that generation, a Southern sympathizer, realized he couldn't stay in Lexington and divide the church there, so planned to make his way to safety, but didn't make it. They arrested him anyway. And if you read the charges, the most outrageous charges, it's like a schoolboy drew up the charges, but they were effective, threw him in prison. Can't go into all the detail, but when he found out what had happened, they had actually mustered him into the Confederate Army as a chaplain. And I don't understand all this detail, but he's able to say, okay, you're obligated to send me there under rules of war. How that won out, I don't know, but he did so for a time. He was actually chaplain to mortgage raiders mainly in Tennessee. But then after about a year, they allowed him to leave, and he spent the rest of the war preaching in Virginia. T.B. Larimore wasn't a Christian yet. He was in the Confederate Army at Shiloh, then was a Confederate scout on the river, good soldier, by the way. Finally captured near Chattanooga, and they gave him the option, non-combatant or go to prison, and he took the first. And this is an amazing story. F.D. Strigley tells it. He says, with all this, he never fired a gun while he was a soldier, but he was in the middle of lots of action, okay? Barton Stone Jr. was in Texas and headed a group from Grayson County, I think is Sherman, gives you an idea of where in Texas. They were at Pea Ridge, and that's how Hall ends up in the story. Randolph Clark, one of the founders of Adran College, is the son of Hetty Despain from North Alabama, moved to Texas. And if he wasn't in a regiment with Stone, he was in a larger company, I think, and probably was at Pea Ridge. Caskey mentioned earlier, first was a chaplain for the 18th Mississippi, went armed. He wasn't sure he killed anyone or broke any arms. He really got caught up into it, but I tried to break as many legs as I could. And if I understand what he's saying, a man with a broken leg takes two to carry off. They won't come back, and so you remove three rather than one. Okay. J.H. Garrison, who will edit the Christian Evangelist, I think he's the most influential of the liberal people among the disciples, last quarter of the 19th century. He grew up in Ozark, Missouri. That's basically Branson, if you've been to Branson. Was at Pea Ridge. Got a serious leg wound that wasn't treated for 24 hours. Before the end of the war, was a captain. It's after the war in northern Illinois, Abingdon College, that he met the restoration. If you want a dark side of the story that maybe everyone needs to see it sometimes and not see the romance of war, John Varr, he was from Kentucky, but he spent a lot of time in Andersonville prison in Georgia. He wrote the story under the pseudonym Sergeant Oates, a prison life in Dixie. But he was a preacher in Iowa after the war, okay? Richard M. Gannot, he was the son of a prominent preacher in northern Kentucky. Went to Bacon, graduated from Bethany, and then Louisville Medical School. To Texas in 1859, organized a unit there, the Grapevine Volunteers, served under Morgan. After Morgan was killed, then he served under Nathan Bedford Forrest at Chickamauga, and then the rest of the war he was sent west. This second battle of Cabin Creek, close to Muskogee, Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, quite a deal. They captured a huge wagon train of supplies from the Union Army there. He got decorated for that. Went back to Kentucky after the war. That was home. Ordained by Hobson, then returned to Texas in the 1870s. I think he was 81, about 1908. and the count is that he probably baptized 6,800 people, so he served effectively after, okay? Garfield, who would eventually become president, was at Middle Creek. He was laid at Shiloh, but supposedly his group affected the battle. Rebuilt bridges and railroads along the Tennessee River, and while it was camped on the river, you perhaps know this story, received an invitation to preach at the Mooresville. Okay, there's no proof on paper that I know, except that people have documented that tradition at Mooresville has handed down the information that he did. That's quite a story. Very likely the preacher who invited him was a preacher who had 2 or 3 sons in the Confederate Army at the time. Okay? Okay, life was dangerous, and there must be 100 or so stories like this, but Jacob Kraft Jr., one of the old preachers, he may have had some Southern sympathies. I think he had a daughter living in Marion, Alabama, or somewhere in the South, but he certainly himself was a pacifist. They wouldn't leave him alone, though. You see his diary entry. They searched the house today looking for an escaped lieutenant. This is the 6th time that I've been searched and they haven't found anything. The next day he has an entry that it's a year anniversary of the day he was out walking. He walked a lot and meditated and prayed, and he was stopped and actually arrested by pickets, and he says this is American liberty in the year of grace, 1862. Okay, you may know this next story. If you don't, Mansell Matthews preached in, again, the Florence area, went to Texas with the group, practically a whole church in the little town in the extreme northwest corner of Alabama, went to Texas. During the war, he was charged with being a traitor. The High Vigilance Committee got hold of him, arrested, and his friend in Fort Worth found out about it and immediately went to Gainesville and basically argued, well, his head may be with the North, but I can tell you his heart is with the South. So the committee decided, okay, we won't put him to death, but we're going to keep him 3 days. Next slide. And the friend thought this cruel and decided I need to find a way to tell him so he's not suffering for 3 days. So he was allowed to go in with a guard, and they immediately started talking Bible and bored the guard, and he wasn't attentive. So the friend asked him his favorite Bible quotation, and then Matthews asked his. Fret not thy gizzard, and zizzle not thy whirligig, thy soul art saved. Matthews got the message, but was so overcome he just shook, but he had to look down because I think if the guard had understood, then
He didn't give you book, chapter, and verse, did he?
no. The guard apparently didn't know. Okay, I'm going to go quickly over this because I'd like to end with Bethany. In many ways, in all of this is hard for me to understand. I think the resolutions from the Missionary Society, the first they met in October 1861, the second 2 years later in 1863, actually did more to divide than fighting one another on the battle field. But the pressures were there from the north. The Abolitionist Missionary Society said, if you'll speak out strongly, we'll dissolve and won't be your rival anymore. A church paper from Missouri had said every disciple preacher of note has taken the neutral position. Well, that got to the Cincinnati papers, and so that was published by all of them, and that puts pressure on the people from the north. There's one, and by the way, the only way they get that done is during recess, so it's an unofficial resolution. But the unofficial resolution is about as effective. And besides, it's a missionary society. What's their purpose? To send the gospel to destitute places. So any of their resolutions would have been unconstitutional. Okay, let's move ahead at least 5 or 6 slides. This is important, what I'm passing over. A lot of the argument is after the war, but it's embitterment due to the resolution. So you have Isaac Arrett in particular in the north, Talbert Fanning for a while, and then David Lipscomb for a long time, in a sense of fighting the war. But if we understand both sides, I think we actually understand from both sides. Okay, this is a good one. This is when the Advocate is revived in 1866, early on, Talbot Fanning will talk about the injustices. And notice in capitals, he says, and approving resolutions in Christian missionary meetings. So that tells you that while he had many grievances, this was one of the worst of all. All right. Okay, Lipscomb enters into this as well. He thought there would be help from the missionary society holding people back from going to battle, but no, to the contrary. They actually encourage the Christian, and those are his questions, italics, and the question mark are his. The Christian work of Christians robbing and slaughtering Christians south. Okay, that's important, but I think I'll pass over and we can go forward. And past this, it is important to understand Arrett believed that they had a righteous cause to react as they did. Here, Fanning tells about some of the trials he went through, just being at home on the side of Franklin College. Okay, let's go forward to Bethany. As I went over a lot of this stuff, it finally hit me. I understand on one hand, the two armies didn't clash in downtown Bethany. They didn't take over the buildings at Bethany. They didn't burn the Campbell mansion. They didn't steal all the livestock or clean out the smokehouse and all of the other sufferings connected with war. But when you take all of that away, actually life in Bethany was like living in a border state. Some of the sufferings in northwest Arkansas, Bethany would equal. Of course, it all starts, all the delegates from west of the Alleghenies, nearly all of them at least, voted against secession. They immediately declare a provisional government. Out of that comes a new state, okay? Brooke County, that's where Bethany is. In the whole county, 109 votes for secession, 52 of them came from Bethany. And so Campbell's nephew, the editor in Wheeling, and I think the paper in Wellsburg close by, called Bethany the nest of secession. So you have the home guards and Bethany entering in just to protect itself, okay? And I'll go down the slide. Wellsburg paper, when the people voted, they published the votes from Bethany in particular, names and how they voted and so forth for secession. Pendleton, the son-in-law, editor of the Harbinger, Mrs. Campbell, Selena, the two younger daughters, and against. Okay, next slide. The story is when the girls discovered their father had voted against secession, they were beside themselves, terrible duplicity, supposedly went to Pendleton pleading their case, and he had to gently reprove them for disrespecting their father. Of course, on the other side, you have Alexander Jr. fighting for the Confederates. The younger son, William, who had difficulty keeping his opinions to himself, almost was sent to, for disloyalty, to prison camp in Ohio, and fortunately came to his senses and avoided that. Junior's wife, Mariana, had a brother, Bethany graduate. Confederate Army died at Bull Run, okay? Brother of Mrs. Campbell, wouldn't take the loyalty oath, spent the time in prison in Ohio. Alexander has two sisters who married abolitionists. One of them frequent contact with John Brown. Selena didn't like being with her sisters-in-law. Another son-in-law, Campbell, was an army, Union Army surgeon. And then there was the nephew, Archibald. Okay, a little bit more, but let's go to the last one, and I think there is kind of a happy ending here. 43, the next one. Alexander Campbell died on Sunday night, late Sunday night, March 4, 1866. On Tuesday, Junior arrives. He'd been in Louisiana again. Wednesday, the nephew, they had been close boyhood friends, but estranged, bitterly estranged during the war. Mariana, Alex's wife, records, Wednesday had gotten Alex to speak and shake hands with Archie, as resentment could do no good and much evil. Forgiveness was the example father, Alexander Campbell, left us to follow. So the story is beside the coffin of Alexander Campbell, the two cousins bitterly divided in war, shook hands and began reconciliation. So I hope we have happy endings like that. But the Bethany thing is not the most important part of the story, but I couldn't resist when I realized, okay, those people in Bethany, the Campbell family itself, actually lived like people lived in war-torn border states.
Amen.
Apologize for keeping you long. Thank you.
Good stuff.